Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7. My name is Ben Francis, and tonight I'm going to be joined by writer and independence advocate and activist William Duguid. Hi.
Hello, good evening, Ben. Good to be back.
So, on to our Ukraine update on day 799 of the conflict. China has been hit with sanctions by the US for supplying, quote, critical inputs to Russia's military industrial base for use in the war against Ukraine. US officials on Wednesday announced a sweeping package targeting nearly 300 entities in Russia, China, and other countries. The targets include dozens of actors accused of enabling Russia to acquire technology and equipment from abroad, including from China, Azerbaijan, Belgium, Slovakia, Turkey, and the United Arab Emirates. The United States has accused Russia of violating the international chemical weapons ban by deploying the choking agent chloropicrin against Ukrainian troops and using riot control chemicals, quote, as a method of warfare in Ukraine. The US government said it will be sanctioning Russian state entities and companies linked to Moscow's chemical and biological weapon programs, including a specialized military unit that, quote, facilitated the use of chloropicrin against Ukrainian troops. Long queues formed in Moscow on Wednesday as the Russian army displayed Western tanks and military hardware captured in Ukraine. It included US, German, and French tanks, along with British and Australian armoured vehicles, and military hardware made in Turkey, Sweden, Austria, Finland, South Africa, and the Czech Republic. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky held a similar exhibition in Kiev in 2023 of captured Russian tanks and equipment. Russia has itself lost more than 3,000 tanks in Ukraine, said the International Institute for Strategic Studies, amounting to its entire pre-war active inventory, but has enough lower quality armoured vehicles in storage for years of replacements, and says it is ramping up production of new tanks for the war. 5 civilians were killed on Wednesday as Russia struck Ukraine's eastern Kharkiv and Donetsk regions, local officials said. Vadim Filashkin, a regional governor, has said 682 residents are holding on in, quote, very difficult conditions with no running water or power in the besieged city of Chaziv which had a pre-war population of 12,500. Months of relentless Russian artillery pounding have devastated the strategic city, which has emerged as the invaders' next major target, sitting on elevated ground that could serve as a gateway to the cities of Konstantinivka, Sloviansk, and Kramatorsk. Ukrainian forces defending Chastivyar have said they are still awaiting fresh ammunition. Ukraine's Nova Pochta Postal and Courier Company said late on Wednesday that a missile had struck its sorting depot in Odessa, but there were no casualties amongst its employees. The Odessa regional governor, Ole Kipper, said at least 13 people were injured in the missile attack, which triggered a large fire. Tomas Yanchukas, a Russian national and UN green card holder, pleaded guilty on Wednesday to lying to the FBI about his U.S. green card, about his participation in a organization that wants to restore, quote, the Russian Empire, including Ukraine. He faces up to 6 months in prison when sentenced on the 11th of July. So, William, just to touch on the US and Chinese sanctions, what effect do you think these sanctions will have on China? And what, do you think they'll cause China to react in any way, potentially pushing it closer to Russia?
Well, I think China is probably already closer to Russia. And
Yeah.
I think, yes, the majority of these sanctions are against Chinese actors, although there are other states announced. I don't think it'll have any great impact on China, which has now got really a pretty robust and large economy. And
Yeah.
I think will probably continue its support. I do think there will be some form of retaliation because that's the sort of thing that you get when there are sanctions. So it's very much a tit for tat thing. Not perhaps a great surprise, but our if you like our sides, the US and UK and others, and the EU, we're getting our hardware to Ukraine in the not too distant future now that the funding has been agreed. So
Yeah.
this is, I think, par for the course and normal business, really.
Yeah, yeah, it is quite expected. Yeah, you're right. So, looking at time, we'll move on to the Israel-Gaza latest. At least 34,596 Palestinians have been killed and 77,816 injured in Gaza since the 7th of October, according to new figures released by the Gaza Health Ministry. During the same period, 474 Palestinians, including 116 children, have been killed in the Israeli-occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, by either Israeli security forces or settlers. The Palestinian news agency Wafa reported that several Palestinian civilians were killed this morning by Israeli airstrikes, which targeted residential buildings and also the, quote, lands and tents of the displaced people east of the city of Rafah. A UN agency said today that rebuilding Gaza would cost an estimated $30 to $40 billion and require an effort on a scale unseen since World War II. Quote, the scale of destruction is huge and unprecedented, UN Assistant Secretary General Abdullah al-Daradi told a press conference in Amman, Jordan. Hamas confirmed that the group will visit Egypt for further ceasefire talks in the Gaza war. A statement by the group added that Hamas chief Ismail Haniyeh had affirmed the group's, quote, positive spirit in studying the ceasefire proposal in a phone call with Egypt's intelligence chief Abbas Kamal. Israel's war cabinet are meeting today to discuss, quote, the next steps in negotiations to achieve a hostage deal. The full security cabinet will meet afterwards, earlier this week. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said Israel would launch a ground operation in Rafah regardless of whether there was a deal or not with Hamas. The outline of the hostage release program that has been proposed is believed to be a 40-day pause in the fighting, while initially female hostages are released in batches of 3 every 3 days in return for Palestinian detainees. 133 hostages are still believed to be captive, although not all of them may be alive. Isaac Herzog, the Israeli president, today has criticized US universities for campus unrest over Israel's war in Gaza, saying these institutions were, quote, contaminated by hatred and anti-Semitism. 2 people have been arrested after shouting verbal abuse and throwing stones and eggs at the demonstrations being held by relatives of those held hostage in Gaza, which was attempting to block a highway in Tel Aviv, Israel. More than 1,600 people have been arrested at 30 schools in the US in the last couple of weeks during the protests about the Israel-Gaza conflict. You can follow our live coverage of that here. The EU offered Lebanon a financial package of $1 billion, which, among other measures, includes supporting Lebanon's armed forces with equipment and training for border management. Iran's Foreign Minister Hossein Amir Abdollahian has issued a statement after speaking to the EU's top diplomat, Joseph Borrell. He said there was a, quote, need to end the Israeli regime's crimes and genocide against Palestinians in Gaza without delay and precondition. The Palestinian Red Crescent Society, PRCS, said on Thursday that the first baby has been born after the reopening of the maternity ward at the Al Amal Hospital in Khan Yunis. The child is named Mohammed Louay Al-Rakab. The risk of exposure to unexploded ordnance in Gaza is at its, quote, most dangerous stage, the United Nations Mine Action Service has warned. So, actually, wait, no, we've got one more story. David Cameron personally recommended that the US should continue to sell Israel arms 2 days after 3 British aid workers were killed in an Israeli arms strike. James Kirby, 47, from Somerset, James Henderson, 33, from Cornwall, and John Chapman, 57, from Dorset, members of the World Central Kitchen, were killed on 1st of April. Lord Cameron recommended arms sales continue only 2 days later, with the decision confirmed by the Business Secretary on 8th of April. Cameron said earlier this week that the strike that killed aid workers revealed systemic and personal failures by the IDF, by the Israeli Defense Force, or the IDF. So, William, just to pick up on the last revelations about David Cameron, do you think the fact that he was so quick to support arms sales after the death of these British citizens could lead us to believe that his statements following the attacks and a lot of other politicians of his, if his party statements following these attacks were not as sincere and more of political posturing, given how fast they were committed to sell arms immediately after their condemnation.
Well, there's always been this contradiction, hasn't there? That we do get criticisms, mild criticisms, it has to be said, of what Israel's been doing from politicians who, at the same time, are quite happy to continue with sending large numbers of arms to the Israel Defense Force. And I thought the timing of the assurance that arms sales would go on was actually fairly insensitive of Cameron. And I'm not quite sure what the families of those killed might have thought of it. There is just total hypocrisy going on through all the nations that support arms to Israel at the moment. And I don't really see it stopping. The people are so far removed now from their governments. And you see the protests, not just now in the US coming on, and large numbers of universities where there are protests happening. The president of Israel is not at all happy about it, but it's a popular movement, and it is not hatred and anti-Semitism. It is just a wish to see the end of violence. But these protests that have been going on now for months with large numbers of people, and still the governments are not swayed from supporting Israel in every reasonable way possible and a lot of unreasonable ways, including arms sales. I don't know where it will end, but it really does need to, because it is incredible hypocrisy.
So to move on to our first and main story of the night, John Sweeney announced his SNP leadership bid in Edinburgh this morning. In Edinburgh this morning, Perthshire North's MSP John Swinney announced his candidacy to become leader of the SNP and next First Minister of Scotland. Mr. Swinney said he was standing under the banner of Uniting for Independence and that he would hope to bring all the talents in the party, including Kate Forbes, together to govern in the best interest of Scotland. Later in the day, following First Minister's questions, Mr. Swinney's closest rival, Kate Forbes, MSP, announced that she would not be putting her name forward to be SNP leader and would be supporting Mr. Swinney to be the next First Minister. John Swinney is 60 years old and has been a member of the SNP since he was 17. He previously led the SNP from 2000 to 2004 and has held various roles in the Scottish Cabinet since 2007, including at Education, Finance and Deputy First Minister, until he stepped back last year when Nicola Sturgeon resigned. Nominations of SNP leader close at midday on Monday, and if there are no other candidates, then Mr. Swinney is expected to be confirmed as SNP leader later that day, and could be nominated to be Scotland's 7th First Minister as early as Tuesday. So, William, there's quite a few questions, obviously, in this story, because it's very big for Scotland. So just firstly, I'm wondering, do you think that another candidate will step forward in the next few days? Like, do you think there's a chance?
There's always a chance, but it looks pretty much as if there isn't going to be another candidate, and if there is, it'll very much be a paper candidate, you would think, because most of the major players have already endorsed John Swinney. Kate Forbes herself, who was the obvious potential alternative candidate, Angus Robertson, Mary McCallan, Shirley Ann Somerville, Fiona Hislop, Stephen Flynn from down in London, and Joanna Cherry, amongst others. So it looks as if the Unity for Independence is the thing going forward here, and I will be very surprised, although you never know. And by the way, my talent for predicting what's going to happen in the future has been shown to be minimal in the past, but I don't think we'll see anybody else this time.
Yeah. So just presuming that he does win and become the leader of the SNP, do you think he'll do quite well at uniting the party? Because obviously that's been quite a big theme of, his leadership. That's a big advertising point of why he wants to be a leader. So do you think he'll succeed in that?
Well, I think that he's made a good start in terms of getting all the endorsements that he has. I do think that he's well regarded within the party. That's fairly obvious from that. And also, of course, since he's local to Perth, I get to hear what the SNP supporting volunteers in the hub are saying about him. And they're all very positive about him, and many of them know him personally, of course. and have had many conversations with him. So I think there is certainly a good chance that he will be able to do some form of uniting of what's been a slightly fractious party. And it's really about bringing in the people who are more on the right. And they have perhaps been a bit. I'm thinking about people like Fergus Ewing, etc., who have been a wee bit detached just recently. Kate Forbes to be endorsing him is a big thing, and it'll be very interesting to see how that pans out. She, of course, is not entirely well regarded within the party, so it's possible that John Swinney may have to be careful about what role he actually does give her. I'm conscious you may be about to ask about this, but so I won't say too much about it. So my basic answer to you is yes, I think he will probably, at least in the short term, be a uniting factor in the party, and that's important because I think they are needing to shore up their electoral offering. I think the Westminster elections will be tricky for them, but then they have to focus on Holyrood 2026.
Yeah, it definitely seems that like within the SNP that seems to be the consensus. So like from listening to his speech, like that seems to be seen as like a good path forward for them electorally. So just the next question, I guess, like following on from that, do you think like if he does manage to unite the party, which it does look like he may well be able to do so, at least more so than in the past, do you think that'll have a big like positive effect in terms of the SNP's polling, which has obviously been declining recently? Do you think that will be enough to maybe bounce the party back if they show like a united front, or do you think there's maybe other issues which are affecting that?
I think there are a large number of issues currently
Yeah.
afflicting the SNP, and unity will help. That's for sure. But they also, I think, need to an extent, restore the idea of firm and cohesive government that is perhaps perhaps it's not deserved because of course the media has a lot to do with this, but that has slipped a little in recent years. I don't necessarily blame Hamza Yousaf for this because I think there was a lot in the way the Butte House Agreement was working between the SNP and the Greens that perhaps led to that, and led to perhaps poor presentation of policy that left it open for the media to criticise. And I suspect that John Swinney will be able to shore a bit of that up, and that may well help. Um, and I think also he's reasonably well regarded by the electorate, and perhaps better regarded than Hamza Yousaf. So I think it's a positive step, but there's still a long way to go. And the path ahead is not going to be easy. It'll be very interesting to see exactly what happens with the Westminster election and how the SNP then reacts to that under John Swinney.
Yeah. So do you think his leadership of the party will have much of an effect in terms of like the SNP's sort of policy in terms of what they, because compared to with under Hamza Yousaf, or do you think it'll be more like continuation of the same?
I think you'll be aware of the difficulties that some of the policy discussions have had in the past. Of course, the SNP will be now coming up with policy on their own without the Green influence,
Yeah.
but also, though, with the need to get the votes of the Greens, and it's most likely going to be the Greens, with anything they do. I mean, they don't have the coalition anymore, but they are, they would hope, going to have some sort of confidence and supply type arrangement where they can make sure that they can get certainly their budgets and their other legislation through. I think if John Swinney is known for anything, it's likely to be practicality. And so he's not going, I think, to do anything stupid or reckless in terms of policy. And he's going to, I think, shore up the presentation of it as far as is possible so that it chimes better with the public. That's certainly something the SNP have lacked in recent months. And I think that needs to be restored. I think he could, though, be the man to do it.
Yeah. So do you think his government will be one that's more stable than Hamza Yousaf's in general? Like, do you think he'll manage to, keep sort of the coalition of Greens, if it's a minority government, keep the coalition of Greens and then the right of his party happy at the same time? Do you think he'll be able to do a good job of that?
I think if Kate Forbes is part of the administration and
Yeah.
has a job in which she can excel, I think that will ensure that that balance remains. It's inherently a less stable government than when the Greens were in coalition because it's a minority government, and there is always the need to get the consent of members of other parties. But John Swinney is a very experienced and, as I said, very practical operator, and I think he will well be able to do that. But as with everything, it's going to be a very unpredictable couple of years going up to Holyrood 2026. And the one thing that would slightly worry me are his personal circumstances. And he talked about his family today, and
Yeah.
I know that's a big consideration for him. And I also hear from those who were talking to him when he left government at the end of Nicola Sturgeon's time, that he was really pretty tired at that point and did need a break. Whether he's had a sufficient break and whether those other pressures in his life cause any difficulties going forward remains to be seen.
So just lastly, before we move on, what do you think, if any, the impact of this, new SNP leader, if he does become leader, will be on the prospects for Scottish independence? Because a big part of his leadership announcement was independence. Do you think that might be brought more into the forefront compared to under Hamza Youssef and even Nicola Sturgeon?
Difficult to be sure. The one thing that Hamza Yousaf tried in the headlines anyway to do was to push independence a bit harder, and there was a greater number of white papers on various independence-related topics that came up. Not many of them were read very widely, it has to be said. But one key indicator might be, will he retain the role of independence minister for somebody? Jamie Hepburn's been the independence minister under Hamza Yousaf and remains that. Will he be kept in post, or indeed will the post itself stay? That will be an indicator of how the independence push is operating under John Swinney. But of course, the other side of the independence push is everybody else in the independence movement, in the other parties, and people of no party whatsoever. They need to step up now, and whereas the SNP will be doing the mechanism of how you get independence, I think that the movement as a whole needs to push very hard and very coherently to represent the independence case, to make sure it gets represented as best it can. And if they do that successfully, the SNP and John Swinney will have no other option but be carried along in its wake, one would hope. So, again, an interesting 2 years in prospect.
Yeah, well, that's a definitely interesting point you bring up about the whole sort of movement, not just the party, yeah, and the role it has to play. But to move on to our next story, the OECD predict UK will be worst performing economy in the G7. According to the latest forecast by the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, published today, the UK will be the slowest growing economy in the G7 next year, and the second worst this year, as a result of high interest rates and restrictive fiscal policy. The OECD has cut its UK growth outlook for GDP to 0.4% this year and 1% in 2025, down from projections of growth of 0.7% and 1.2%, respectively, in March. The UK will fall to the bottom of the G7 growth league in 2025, the OECD predicts, with growth of 1%, behind Germany, US, and Canada. The US and Canada are forecasted to be the fastest growing economies in the G7 next year, both growing by 1.8%. Commenting, the SNP's economy spokesperson, Drew Hendry MP, said, quote, Scotland's future is broken. Brexit Britain looks truly grim, with the UK set to be the worst performing of all the advanced economies in the G7, and a Labour government that plans to keep Tory tax plans and austerity. Independence inside the EU is now vital if Scotland, our economy, businesses, and our people are to grow and prosper. Quote, small independent countries inside the EU, such as Ireland and Belgium, are set up to have higher growth and lower inflation rates than the UK. As an independent country inside the EU, Scotland's economy could also grow and prosper, and we could achieve a greener, fairer economy. So, William, just on that story, why do you think that the UK economy has been so stagnant in recent years, and to a greater extent, I guess, since 2008? And how do you think governments should try and address this, like, quite systemic issue within the UK?
Well, I think one of the initial things in the whole period you're speaking about was the austerity agenda of
Yeah.
what was then the Lib Dem Tory coalition and subsequently of the Tory government. Brexit then in 2016, I think, has had a major role and a role that's sort of fed through very slowly because it took a little while actually to work out how the UK was going to leave the EU. And then some of the other things that are going to hold things back, such as increased border checks, etc., have been released very
Mm.
gradually into the economy. And I think the whole experience since 2008, when the economy took a great dunt, it hasn't really followed policies that would achieve growth. And then that makes it always be in a sort of bad condition when the next blows come along. So when, for example, COVID comes along, the economy is not as able to handle it as might previously have been the case. So as a result of all of that, we've had higher interest rates than most countries, if not all countries, and it looks as if that's going to go on for a while. That's going to hold things back. We've had inflation, of course, and I know that the high interest rates are supposed to help with that, but a lot of the causes of that inflation have not been anything that over which we do have any great control. So the interest rates being high is just actually discouraging people from spending, which in itself means there's less growth. And then because of Brexit, we've got staff shortages in many sectors, and consequently, um, that holds things back as well. So those are the things that are really stymieing growth in the UK economy at the moment. And the only fig leaf, so to speak, that Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, seems to be able to come up with is looking at the projected growth figures for 6 years. And lo and behold, they show that the UK, which is, of course, starting from a much lower base, will have higher growth figures than almost anybody else. But a forecast 6 years out means as good as nothing because so many things can come in to distort the picture before then. So it's a sick economy. It is a basket case. Drew Hendry is absolutely right. And when people say that an independent Scotland can't look after itself, sometimes you ask yourself, well, how could it actually do worse than that, particularly if it leads to some of the root causes, such as, for example, Brexit, beginning to be addressed?
So, on to the next story, local elections in England and Wales. Voting is underway in local elections in England, where the Conservatives are anticipating heavy losses that could further destabilise Rishi Sunak's premiership. The elections, which cover more than 2,600 council seats across 107 English councils, are seen as a key test of whether the Conservative Party is as unpopular as the polls suggest. 10 metro mayors, including London, are also being contested, as well as 37 police and crime commissioners in England and Wales. There are no elections in Scotland or Northern Ireland, and no local council elections in Wales. There is also a parliamentary by-election in Blackpool South, whose former Tory MP Scott Benton resigned after being found guilty of breaching standard rules in a lobbying scandal. Labour said it was hopeful of taking back the seat, which Benton won with a majority of 3,690 in the 2019 general election. This set of local council seats was last contested in May 2021 when the Conservatives under Boris Johnson were at a high point after the UK's COVID vaccine rollout, and the party enjoyed its strongest performance since 2008. Conservatives have been predicted to lose as many as 500 council seats, about half of those the party is defending this time around. The mayoral contests in the West Midlands and Tees Valley will be closely watched, as Andy Street and Ben Hutchison come under pressure from Labour. Polling suggests the West Midlands contest is very close, with the Labour candidate, Richard Parker, just 2 points behind Andy Street. In Tees Valley, Ben Hutchison was 7 points ahead of his Labour rival Chris McEwan in pre-election polls. The Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, is seeking a third term, with YouGov polling suggesting that he is leading the Tory candidate Susan Hall by 22 points. There are concerns in Downing Street that Sunak could face a leadership challenge if the Conservatives were to lose both the West Midlands and Tees Valley mayoralties. Meanwhile, the Veterans Minister has apologised to former military personnel who have been prevented from using their veteran's ID to vote in the local elections in England today. So, William, just on Rishi Sunak there, do you think there will be or do you think a threat of a rebellion is quite real if he does badly in these elections, especially the two mayoral races I've just talked about?
Well, it's possible. I suspect the Tories have resigned themselves to a bit of a drubbing in the general election to come, no matter what happens. This will be seen as an indication of how heavy that drubbing is likely to be, whether
Mm-hmm.
we're at one of these stages where there's a sea change in politics and voters just want rid of a particular party at Westminster. So they'll be looking very carefully at that. But I suspect that it'll just be a case of, well, how bad is it? Because it's bad enough to be really, really bad going forward to the Westminster election. It will perhaps affect the timing of the Westminster election in that a result that isn't quite as bad as they feared it might be a let's go for it now situation,
Mm.
and suddenly you get a snap election in July. Or it might be just hang on to as near as possible the last minute. Maybe not January, because that's a horrible month to have an election, but the original theoretical dates of October or November. So, your question, will Rishi Sunak face a leadership challenge? I think that would be insane on the Tories' part to have another prime ministerial change and a truly, if you like, unelected prime minister, in contrast to some of the accusations that's been thrown the Scottish government's way. Another prime minister in such a short period, who's only going to presumably therefore last about as long as the general election, is not a sign of a party in great health at all. And in some ways, it might be as well in the Westminster election for the Tory party to put out of its misery. It'll be interesting to see what the turnout is and what the results are and what the consequences are.
Yeah, I mean, I think it definitely would be insane to have another election, but it's still possible. They've had quite a lot already, so you never know with the Conservative Party. But just finally, before we move to the next question, I'm just wondering if you think these elections could potentially see Reform UK, the Brexit party is, changed, formerly the Brexit Party, perhaps get quite high results and establish itself as more of a major political party in the UK.
Well, it's again that's possible. I think they are standing in quite a number of places, and of course, going forward, they plan to stand in quite a number of places, including
Hmm.
Scotland, in the Westminster general election. Um, the Reform Party are, if you like, the gravitational pull on the Tory party to the right. So that'll be one of the reactions. If Reform does particularly well, the Tories will see that as evidence that they're not right wing enough and they need to get more right wing and maybe see if we can pull Nigel Farage back into the party and all sorts of things. So, yeah, that's one of the things that are well worth looking at. And I think there was a previous election, council election, in which what was then the Brexit Party did particularly well. And I think that had an influence. So, yep, that'll be one of the things to look at. Not till tomorrow, fortunately, since the results don't really come through in great numbers until then. We don't want an overnighter on this, but interesting nevertheless.
Yeah, no, we'll definitely see about that. I mean, there is some polling, like mayoral polling in Manchester, I think, where a Reform candidate is like head to head with the Conservatives. So yeah, we'll definitely see what happens there.
Mm.
But just to the next story, protesters in London block coach taking asylum seekers, or sorry, protesters in London block coach taking asylum seekers to Bibby, Stockholm. There was a standoff in London today after a coach sent to collect asylum seekers and take them to Bibby Stockholm barge was surrounded by protesters. Dozens of demonstrators blocked the coach before it was able to pick up passengers, surrounding it on all sides. Hours later, the bus was still at the scene, while protesters were also sitting in front of a number of police vans carrying a number of people who were arrested. Home Secretary James Cleverly condemned the protests in a statement, saying that they, quote, will not deter us from doing what is right for the British public. At First Minister's Questions today, Scottish First Minister Hamza Yousaf denounced the Home Office's inhumane and cruel detention raids on asylum seekers and urged. Oh, I'm just getting an update. The bus has been blocked, like as of now, so they didn't manage to go through with it. So anyway, as I was saying, raids on asylum seekers and urged the UK government to scrap their Rwanda policy. At least 8 asylum seekers living at a Best Western hotel in Peckham were told a week ago that they would be collected on Thursday morning by coach to relocate to Bibby Stockholm, moored at Portland in Dorset. The coach was then expected to collect other passengers along the way, but was blocked in when it was surrounded by protesters after pulling in at a bus stop at about 8 a.m. At least one person was knocked to the ground and received medical attention after police moved in around 12:30 a.m. The people who were due to be removed are said to include teenagers who are attending college in the area. A number of men staying at the hotel said they feared the conditions that would await them on the Bibistock home, where an Albanian man called Leonardo Faruku died last year in a suspected suicide attempt. So, William, do you think the government's harsh immigration policy could risk losing its support? Or do you think, unlike these protesters, most would-be Tory voters and maybe a large section of the British public actually support this migration action?
Well, the reason for one of the reasons anyway for the harsh immigration policy is that the Tories think it does play well with their target vote.
Mm.
And certainly that's, as I said, I mentioned earlier, the gravitational pull of Reform UK, and it's really part of that. But of course, it goes back really to Theresa May as Home Secretary and her hostile environment. But it's all a dog whistle for the voters. However, not everybody by any means is a Tory. And in the first past the post system, of course, the Tories' results have been thus far amplified because they can get a large majority with perhaps less than 40% of the vote. The rest of the voters are not necessarily as happy about the treatment of asylum seekers. And it's, in a way, refreshing to see shades of Kenmure Street in Glasgow a couple of years ago. The same things happening today in Peckham, and last week in, I think, Margate. Similar attempts to remove people from hotel accommodation to the Bibby Stockholm have been frustrated, and long may that continue. I think I was very proud of Glasgow when the Kenmure Street protest similarly prevented asylum seekers and refugees from being removed. With regard to Hamza Yousaf, I think he was very specifically asked about the reported early start of the Rwanda process. So he wasn't necessarily specifically referring to today, but nevertheless, it's a refreshing comment to hear Scotland standing up for asylum seekers, the Scottish government really taking a totally different attitude to the UK government. And again, long may that continue, because asylum and the refugee system is important. It's something that the UK signed up to in 1951, and it's incumbent on us to do it properly. If you are paying too much on hotel accommodation, it's not necessarily cheaper to either take a small proportion of your refugees to Rwanda or indeed to take them to maybe Stockholm. The sensible thing to do is to invest in an asylum system that processes claimants quickly and have arrangements to return them to other countries who are willing to take them and are genuinely safe, unlike Rwanda, if they do not fit the criteria. It's all down to honouring international agreements, and the UK has not starred in that particular regard of late.
So to move to our next story, concerns growing over donations to Van Gathing's campaign in Wales. Campaign in Wales. There are growing concerns in Wales over the new Welsh First Minister Van Gathing taking 200,000 from a company whose owner was convicted of environmental crimes. Amid accusations, it was critically undermining his authority and could cost the Labour Party votes at the general election. Gathing, who made history when he became the first black leader of a European country in March, is facing growing calls to pay the money back and order an independent inquiry into the donations, which helped him secure a narrow victory in the race to replace prior Welsh First Minister Mark Drakeford. This week, Plaid Cymru led debates in the Senedd on the issue, and in the House of Commons there were calls from an independent investigation. A worrying development for Gathing is the growing tension within the Labour Party that the party is being drawn into sleazy Westminster-style donation scandal. To 100,000 pound donations from Gathing's campaign came from a company called Dowson Environmental Group, whose director, David John Neal, was convicted of environmental crimes. Gathing has ordered an internal review led by another former First Minister, Carwyn Jones, while repeatedly emphasising that he has not broken any rules. Since he won the leadership race, Gathing has taken place in 3 First Ministers' question sessions, and on each occasion was criticised for his donations. Plaid Cymru has a cooperation agreement with Labour, but its leader, Rhwn ap Loreth, said the issue risked poisoning Welsh politics. He said, quote, "This isn't the kind of politics we want in Wales. This leaves a very bad taste that needs to be cleared up. Any money left over from Gathing's campaign is expected to be returned to the UK Labour Party." Rhwn ap Loreth said the Labour Party will have to decide whether they will accept money which has came from a company whose boss has been found guilty of environmental crimes. So, William, I guess my question is more broadly, do you think large financial contributions from, large financial interests in the UK to buy influence from politicians is a broader problem within UK politics? And do you think it's a problem within the Labour Party?
I think it has been a broader problem within UK politics. I think we should be far more stringent upon what donations are acceptable and at what level, and the level of checking that you need to do into who's giving the money. And it's not a particular problem for the Labour Party, but this specific one is certainly a problem for the Labour Party. So, and it could leak through to UK Labour, who, as you said, were the ultimate recipients of any money left over. Of course, we don't know how much money actually is left over. So, yeah, I think the whole system really does need a wee bit of reform. As was quite correctly said, no rules have been broken. We've heard that so often, and it is actually technically true. But the same was said of David Cameron's involvement with Greensill, and it really says more about the rules than about the actual actions that have taken place. There is legality, if you like, or acting within the rules, and there is also taking a moral, ethical position, and more importantly, even than the moral and ethical, at least from the point of view of politicians, this is politically incendiary, and therefore I think either the money will end up being given back, or Von Gething's future will be not very protracted as First Minister of Wales.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a good point you make about the rules and who's writing the rules. Because I guess those people writing the rules to regulate themselves, you can perhaps see a bit of an issue with that setup for financial regulation within British politics. But looking at time, we'll have to move on to the next story. Trump's hush money trial continues in New York. The lawyer who negotiated hush money deal on behalf of 2 women alleged to have had affairs with Donald Trump is set to continue testifying in Donald Trump's criminal trial in Manhattan today. Keith Davidson has already testified about how deals to pay Karen McDougal and Stormy Daniels came together in 2016. Prosecutors are using his testimony to help jurors understand the mechanisms of Trump's efforts to pay off women and convene jurors that it will, or sorry, convince jurors that it was done in the service of his campaign. Davidson took to the stand on Tuesday and testified, among other things, about efforts to try and wrangle Michelle Cohen Michael Cohen, Trump's personal lawyer, to wire the $130,000 he had agreed to pay Daniels for her silence in the closing days of the campaign. Asked why he believed Cohen was delaying payment, Davidson said, quote, I thought he was trying to kick the can down the road until after the presidential election. Prosecutors want Davidson's testimony to corroborate the upcoming testimony of Cohen, a key witness in the case, who negotiated the deal on Trump's behalf. Trump's lawyers have already signaled that they will aggressively attack Cohen's credibility in the case, painting him as a liar and someone who has an axe to grind. Judge Juan Merchan started today's proceeding by hearing 4 additional instances in which Trump is accused of violating the gag order in the case. Prosecutors raised the violations last week. The 4 alleged violations involve 2 comments about Cohen, one about the jury, and one about David Pecker. Merchan has barred Trump from attacking witnesses in the case or jurors. Earlier this week, Judge Merchan fined Trump $9,000 for violations of the gag order and maintained that Trump take down offending posts from Truth Social. Trump complied with the request for removal on Tuesday. So, how much do you think, if at all, this will affect Trump? Because recently the polling has tightened slightly in the race. So, do you think there's a chance that these court cases might actually be having an effect on, or could actually have an effect on, the presidential election coming up?
Well, Trump seemed untouchable for so long. It would be a foolhardy person that would say, "Oh, this is when the tide really starts to turn." But I suppose the drip of embarrassing and just plain wrong actions by Trump may ultimately, yes, have their result. But it seems that he can't stop. I mean, it's not that the gag order is just only for him. This is for all defendants. You're just not allowed to criticise or make statements about jurors or indeed witnesses or anybody else directly involved in the case. I think Trump's entitled, by the way, strangely enough, to speak about prosecutors and judges. That's not a problem. But he's just going to go on getting fined if he carries on like this. And he seems unable to stop himself. And that, in a sense, to if you like, his minders, assuming they don't encourage it, it would be the most worrying thing of all. Because if he does something that clearly acts to his detriment, certainly his financial detriment, only in okay, he might see it as a bagatelle, and just keeps doing it. What does that say about his general judgment and fitness to be president? I know we've been through all of that for really many years, but if I were a voter who was a floating voter in the incredibly polarized, so there aren't that many of them, incredibly polarized United States, that's what I would be asking. And that's where maybe the effect of this and perhaps the other forthcoming trials may be.
Yeah, I guess we'll see. Yeah, maybe. I mean, I was surprised, to be honest, at the polls tightening a bit, but I didn't think it'd have that much effect, given, how much Trump supporters seem to, stay stable despite, whatever he does, basically. But yeah, no, it's interesting. I wonder do you think it's got to do with this court case at all? The recent tightening in polls.
The polls can tighten for all sorts of reasons.
That's true.
It could be that what Biden's support for Israel is helping him at this stage. But it could also then be subsequently that what's going on at the universities and the action being taken against protesters doesn't help him. It really is a dark art to know how polling changes. But I think one thing on its own is not going to do it. But a sequence of things, such as Trump's increasingly erratic behavior, may do.
Yeah,
Let's hope so. I don't want to be partisan, but yes, I do.
Yeah, we'll find out. You never know. And on to our next story. Scottish Government urges parents not to miss out on disability support. Parents of disabled children are being urged to make sure they are not missing out on vital financial support from the Scottish Government. Child disability payment is money to help families cover the extra costs of looking after a child or young person who is disabled, has a long-term health condition, or is terminally ill. Since being introduced in 2021, over 78,000 children and young people have received the payment, with more than £500 million being paid out in total. Social Justice Secretary Shirley Ann Somerville met parents and children at Karen Grange High School in Grangemouth to hear about their experiences of applying for and receiving the benefit, and to urge other parents to apply. Child disability payment paid by Social Security Scotland has replaced disability living allowance for children from the Department for Work and Pension. The devolved benefit, designed in partnership with parents of disabled children and charities, was designed to be as straightforward and stress-free as possible. Light touch reviews were introduced for children whose condition has not changed since the original application was made. This means children with lifelong disabilities do not need to face ongoing lengthy reviews to continue getting financial support. Social Justice Secretary Shirley Ann Somerville said, quote, "Far too many families found the previous DWP scheme complicated and stigmatizing. We were determined to change that, and hearing from parents showed that we have. Quote, the Scottish Government's social security system is built on encouraging people to apply, supporting them in the process, and getting the decision right the first time. I'm pleased child disability payment is there to support families who need extra help, and I urge anyone whose child is eligible to apply." So, William, do you think that this disability payment is, how much do you think it'll help, families with disabled children, and do you think it's enough support for them at the moment?
Well, whether it's enough will depend on the individual circumstances of the family. And of course, it's not the only benefit that those families may be able to claim as well. So
Mm-hmm.
you need to look at that in the round. I think more than the money, the important thing about the Scottish social security system that's gradually now beginning to emerge is this fundamental difference with the UK one, which was another sort of hostile environment for claimants. And it was indeed overcomplicated, and it did tend to be stigmatizing. And the Scottish Government approach was set out from the very beginning to be a very different sort of thing, to be actually supportive and making it easier to apply, and then not making renewal of a benefit related to a condition that wasn't going to change, not making that too complicated. The other important thing that you mentioned last in that list was getting decisions right first time, so you're not in a prolonged struggle to get what really your child requires in order just to keep going. So I think if it were reported by the mainstream media accurately, which sadly it is not, the Scottish social security system, the way it looks after people, is one of the triumphs of the Scottish Government over the last 5 years, and it should indeed be celebrated more.
So, on to our last story. Scottish Government consultation on legislation to protect fans from ticket touts. Proposals which will help to protect people against the threat of ticket touts at the UEFA Euro 2028 tournament are the focus of a new consultation, which has been launched by the Scottish Government today. Glasgow is one of the 10 host cities for Euro 2028, and is expected 3 million tickets will go on sale for the whole tournament, allowing more fans than ever before to access UEFA Euro tournament. As part of the consultation, stakeholders are invited to share their insights about how effective the measures implemented during UEFA Euro 2020, which took place in 2021, were for both supporters and local businesses. Europe Minister Kaukab Stewart said, quote, "Glasgow has become one of the world's top cities for staging major sporting events, and Euro 2028 will follow in the footsteps of the recent World Athletics Indoor Championship. These matches belong to everyone, and it's important we ensure tickets are accessible. Quote, I would encourage everybody with an interest in this eagerly awaited event to share their views and help to shape the legislation ahead of Euro 2028 happening in Glasgow. So, William, do you think this sort of selling tickets more expensively, selling on tickets was quite a big problem in the last Euros that was also in Glasgow?
Well, it's uh, it's always a problem with sporting events ticket touting, and for the big events and Euro 2020 as was and 2028 as will be is one of the big football events, and there is a huge demand for tickets, and consequently it's a great hunting ground for ticket touts, and it does need to be stamped out. It's basically uh, just pure greed, and I think consultation is the right way to go, because yes, there is a recent experience just 3 years ago of um, how that was handled and whether it worked or not, whether there's anything else that should be done, and it's getting the measures in place in good time for Euro 2028, which is 4 years away. So it's just coming at the right time. Yep, I think it's good to consult, and I think it's good to stamp out ticket touting as far as possible.
Yeah, because I mean the tickets are expensive enough as it is, so you don't want them reselled at a higher price for sure.
Oh no.
No. And just before we go, are you a football fan? Are you excited to watch Euro 2028 in Glasgow? I wasn't even aware it was in Glasgow until doing the research for the story.
Well, Glasgow's only one of 10 grounds throughout the UK and Ireland. But yes, I think as you're hearing the voice in my ear saying, I'm looking forward to Euro 2024. I'm hoping that Scotland's injuries all clear up and that they're able to get through the group for the first time in a major competition ever. But I'll be very interested to see who's in the expanded group of players. There'll be some new faces because there are injuries, but also because the player pools are a bit bigger. And yeah, I'll be kind of glued to the television a wee bit for Euro 2024 and keeping my fingers very firmly crossed.
Yeah, well, I guess we can always hope. Scotland makes it through, for the first time ever. So,
Amazing.
well, yeah, that's all I've got time for this evening. But before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. Our focus must now move to securing the future of independent broadcasting for Scotland by growing our subscriber base and regular funding. So, thank you to our guest, William. Thanks, William.
Thank you very much. Enjoyed it.
Thanks. Goodbye, and thank you for watching.